Welcome to the Escape the Drift podcast. I am Dr. Jacob Egbert. Today's topic or title is Unapologetically Sexual. Now, that may be a sensational opener, and it's intentional. And here's why. The intention of this podcast is to demonstrate freedom. And this is an underlying theme of everything that I do. The title of the podcast, Escape the Drift. The drift is essentially a captivity in the way things are supposed to be, or the way that you perceive them to be put upon you by others, essentially. And as we navigate our lives, we find ourselves in situations all the time where we're doing things that others have put on us, or the way we perceive that others have put things on us. So I chose the topic sex and being sexual for a very specific reason. I think this is one of the most hot button taboo type topics that a lot of people get worked up over, whether that's internally or externally. And so I wanted to address it head on. So other areas of conflict or controversy may be religion, which there's some overlap. Politics, of course, can be quite contentious and controversial. And then a number of other social issues. But essentially, the way we interact with other people, the way that we put ourselves out there is something that really draws emotion and limitation and hesitation in order to maintain the comfort of others, or at least the perceived comfort of others. So I talked about this in our last podcast, the Burning Man podcast, where I went over some of the details of why you won't go. And largely that came down to the fact that you're afraid of what other people think. You're afraid of their discomfort. You're afraid of the things that they've put out there as right or wrong and falling in line with in order to be accepted by external forces. So the drift is that which pulls you along without your consent, without your intention, without your design, without your creation. You're just going with the flow of everyone else. And so I bring up the topic of sexuality because this is something that has impacted my own personal life historically in such a way that when I made decisions to free myself from it, my life just elevated. It became so much better, so much more powerful for me as a human. So becoming unapologetically sexual was one of the biggest steps in my personal freedom that I have taken yet. And I want to get into that. So, background. I grew up in a very religious home, a very religious culture, and everyone that I knew through my entire childhood and up to adulthood followed the same tenets that I was taught, essentially. You know, a few people here and there that may have fallen away, but really every single person that I interacted with was of the same faith or religious perspective. And one of the components or tenets of that religion was a sexual purity. And I say that almost mocking, and I apologize to those that follow the religion and hold it dear to them. I don't want to mock you, and I don't want to mock anyone's belief system. I have underlying emotions still. As much work as I've done to overcome, I still have hurt that is seated in my subconscious toward some of the things that I dealt with as a youth. And I'm going to talk about it briefly. I have a really specific point I want to get to, but let's get the backstory. So I grew up in this religious culture where sexuality was a no-go, essentially. Like, you cannot have sex, you cannot have sexual thoughts, no sexual acts, either with others or by yourself. All of it was off limits. Now, the only outlet that I can even conjure up in my mind was as a young man, a young boy, teenage boy, let's say, the only sexual outlet you had was dreams. well, I think I read the term nocturnal emission, the wet dream. It's so like base, but that's just reality. Like that was the only sexual outlet you had. You were not allowed to masturbate. You were not allowed to have any sort of sexual interaction with the opposite sex, or obviously same sex in this setting. And sexual thoughts were not to be entertained. So where does it go? Well, you have to wait for a subconscious release in a dreamlike state where your body's like, I've had enough of this, we're going to let go. That was it. That was your outlet. Now, as a young boy, I didn't have the self-control to follow those rules. I didn't. I would try, and I would fail. And I would try, and I would fail, and I would try, and I would fail. And the result of this, failing over and over, in the context of what I perceive currently as an excessively strict way of looking at self-control, there came upon me, or into the mix of my being, was shame. Now, guilt and shame go together. Guilt is that feeling of the thing I did was wrong. And shame is, I am wrong. And I believe shame was put on those of us who were attempting to follow these rules in the term of worthiness. The term worthiness was afforded to those who were able to follow strictly these rules. If you followed the rules, you were therefore worthy. If you did not follow the rules, you were considered to be unworthy. So your worth was diminished. Your worth as a human being was diminished when you did not follow or comply with the prescribed way of being. Now, there were, of course, doctrinally caveats. You could repent, you could, do the necessary reparation to receive worthiness back. It was afforded you by an authority. Okay, so that's some of the things that you can probably perceive some of my upset still toward that system. And it exists, and I'm not going to deny it. I'm not going to pretend like it doesn't exist. So, there was this shame, this I am not worthy, that pervaded my entire youth up into adulthood. I went and served a 2-year mission for this church, and during that time, similar expectations, if not more expectation, to maintain worthiness. And there was still failure. So, as a human being, I have sexual desires. And this is where the unapologetically sexual comes out. I am going to be stating, from my perspective, that I have drives, desires, and appetites, whatever you want to call all of these, within your own understanding of sexual proclivities. So I have that. And there's a mounting energetic buildup, as many of you know. And when that comes to a point where it becomes very uncomfortable, there are really easy and pleasurable, wonderful ways to release, whether that's with a partner or by yourself. And then it begins again, the buildup, and then the release, the buildup, release. And that becomes this wonderful, beautiful part of life. Now, all appetites are like this, similar to physical nutrition or sustenance. You become hungry. There are hormones that stimulate within you a drive to retain or to obtain nutrient or food. So you continue to build a hunger until it is satisfied. And that's hormone driven, similar to the sex drive, which is hormone driven. And so as the appetite builds, it's satiated, it drops, and then it builds again, and then it drops. And that is the ebb and flow, the natural component or process of life. So I was talking to my wife, and she's like, well, maybe you should say something like this. Sex is the purpose of life. And I'm like, okay, that's cool. And I think there's a way to look at that. But the way I like to look at it is life is the purpose of sex. And there's a little tangent here. yet I want to point it out. Every single one of your ancestors had sex successfully. Every single one of them for 300,000 to 400,000 years as Homo sapiens, and 2 million years prior to that as the previous hominid humanoids that existed in evolutionary advent of today. Every single one of those ancestors of yours successfully had sex, meaning brought offspring into the world. So that life force that flows, that continues to promote and propagate the human species and all other species, all other life-giving organisms and other things, trees, plants, bugs, insects, animals, etc. Sex is the central component to all of that. So to deny that power, to deny that it's an essential component of being alive is just silly. So of course that's not really where we're going, but I wanted to state clearly that life is the purpose of sex. Without sex, there is no life. It just stops. Okay, so there's these internal mechanisms that promote life, that promote the progression, the procreation, the offspring, the continuation of existence for that life vessel. Cool. So as this upbringing has influenced me, and I had this shame of me not being worthy, not good enough, not complete. In contrast with everything, all the signals that my body was giving me, this natural flow, this nature flow, this promoting of life that exists, and I was to shut it off. It didn't work for me. And this is the central point that I want to get to, and I'm going to build up to it here in a moment. I got married quick. Right off of this mission, I found a partner, and I'm like, this one's okay. Let's go. And I don't mean it like that. I just mean like, boom, there's one. Let's get married. Let's have kids. Let's start our life. A big motivator was sex, honestly. And that's not, I wouldn't say that was a conscious on the front of my, like, why are you getting married? Number one, have sex. No, it was subconscious. I knew in the context of the culture and the things that I've agreed to with this religious perspective, I was not allowed to have sex with anyone until married. So of course, well, there's the door. Do you want what's in it? Of course. So I get married. And of course I have kids. We have this life. We're together for a decade. And during that time, I had my own sexual desires. And I wasn't as forthright with them in this relationship. And what happens is I put them in the dark. I held them deep within. And a lot of that was because of shame. Unworthiness was the consequence of having this perspective, of having these desires, of having these fantasies, of having these thoughts, of wanting to take these actions. All of which at this point in my life are completely beautiful and normal and appropriate. But in that context, it didn't work. And therefore I had to hide them. I didn't have to, but I chose to hide them in order to avoid the shame and unworthiness being out in front of others. And so it was in the dark. And eventually I made choices in my marriage that violated the marriage, and I ended up divorced. And it basically, I went through a very traumatic transition out of that life. Now, I had moments in the transition where I could have gone back. And I had really deep conversations with myself. I had to be really frank. I had to be really open and just honest. And I had this conversation. Can I go back? And there were so many reasons to. Kids, finances, culture, etc. And I knew that I couldn't do it from a biological perspective. And I know that sounds like an excuse of some kind, but like in order to meet all of my needs, psychologically, physically, etc., I would have just gone back into the dark. And I just knew that. I knew that my tendencies, etc., just would have gone there. And so I powerfully chose, and when I say powerfully, it's unapologetic. I'm like, this is who I am, and this is what I need, and what I want, and how I'm going to be. And I choose that. I am unapologetically sexual. And I use this, again, as sort of that sensational declaration. It's sensational, and it has so many other avenues. I'm unapologetically open-minded. I'm unapologetically in pursuit of excellence. I'm unapologetically compassionate. I have so many areas of life that I've become unapologetic about. This is who I am, and I will not compromise that. So I'm using sexuality as the delivery system here. Okay, so I chose not to go back to that situation. I chose not to go back to that religion. I chose not to go back to that marriage and culture and society. And so I chose another path. I've said I will no longer hold those things in the dark because, and here's where I want to get to the point. Do not make decisions in the dark. Those things that I held in the dark, those desires, those thoughts, those needs, those things that were part of my human that I hid, that I kept in the dark, it was in the dark. And then I acted in the dark on those things without clarity, without vision, without honesty, without sharing it with those that will be greatly impacted. It was all in the dark, and I made decisions in the dark. And in the dark, it was destruction. There was destruction as a result, as a consequence of the decisions I made in the dark. And so what I want to highlight here is that's a principle for life. If you make decisions in the dark, the likelihood of those being good decisions or beneficial decisions or workable decisions is very low. Had I brought my desires and thoughts into the forefront, I could have had a conversation. I said, this is what I need. Does this work for you? Yes or no? Yes, cool. Let's have this part of our life. No, I need to make decision. I need to pick a path that works for me and you because this doesn't work for you. And then we'd go in our separate directions openly and in agreement. And the pain, there will be pain, as all decisions like that have, but it would be significantly less than the pain that I caused by making decisions in the dark. Okay, so that's a learning experience for me. Making decisions in the light, with clarity, with the ability to see all details, with all consequences, with all people being a participant that are affected. It's in the light, it's clear, it's open. That is pure honesty. That is unapologetic living. And therefore, that is how I've chosen to be there thereafter. And there was years of like getting there. Like I really had some bad habits, we'll say, that didn't work. Some habits that did not work. I still had this tendency to reflexively hide things. Reflexively put it into the dark because that was where I was familiar. And I knew it didn't work, yet it was easy. And so over the years, I slowly opened up and started bringing things into the light. I met and married my wife, Amelia. And I had the ability to be very open with her. And like I said, there was still a transition where it was a slow, like full openness. But a lot of areas of my life, I was able to be like, this is how I am. This is what I like. This is what I like to do. And she's like, me too. Let's play. And we have had an amazing experience with each other since then because of the openness and the unapologetic approach. Okay, I won't get into details there. But essentially saying that over the years, I've continued to push this envelope of unapologetic living, unapologetic sexuality, all within, and I just want to like give this huge caveat here. Everything that I'm discussing is within consensual realms. This is nothing deviant or dangerous or anything like that. It's all consensual. So the permission that I gave myself to be this way has just given me freedom. I escaped the drift and I put my paddle in the water and I said, this is where I'm going. I will not follow something that doesn't work for me. I will not be a way that is so counter to my human being that the discomfort overrides me and I start to put things in the dark. Had that religious setting for me been something that I could be like, yes, I want this. I love the way this works. Like these principles of commandment and lifestyle, like, okay, I'm on board. I love this. Let me jump headfirst into that life. My paddle would be in the water and I would be like, let's go. It's intentional. It wasn't for me. And I'm going to say this. I did not choose that life. I was born into it. I was in the drift of the society, in the culture. Everyone around me, like I said, was in this. And I was just like, this is what we're doing. And if I choose to do anything outside of it, I'm shamed. I'm made wrong. I'm unworthy. And therefore it went in the dark. Again, to come full circle. I shoved everything into the dark and I made decisions in the dark, which had calamitous, destructive result. And therefore, now, I do not make decisions in the dark. Life principle. This is what I follow. Now, there are other ways to look at this, other areas of life. I'm just going to, let's apply it to other areas. Here's another one. You've heard that phrase, nothing good happens after 10 p.m. or something. Maybe your parents told you as you're going out. That's very wise in some regard. As it gets dark, and this is just like a almost analogous but applicable way to look at it. As it gets dark at night, as you get tired, especially as the hours get deeper into the night, as it gets darker, your ability to make sound decisions begins to decrease. So, for example, my wife and I, every now and then, let's say one of us wakes up in the night and we're like, oh, this thing's been bothering me. Let's talk about it. We usually get in an argument. We get emotionally triggered easier, and it turns into, we've had some of the worst and dumbest fights in the middle of the night. And then we'll go to sleep, we'll wake up, we'll be refreshed in the morning. The sun is coming up, it's light. And then we're like, what was that about? And we can have this beautiful conversation where we resolve things quickly. And that's just another example of in the dark, and it's literal in the sense, but it's more about the fact that our capacities have been decreased due to fatigue, stress, etc. And that's another one. When you're highly stressed, when things are not clear, that's again another way of looking at it as it's in the dark. When you're making decisions on a snap emotional basis, it's not clear. It's not been brought to the light. So dreams that you have, like this amazing vision, like this is how it's going to be. Well, it's still in the dark. It hasn't been brought to the light and looked at clearly with all details, and everyone being impacted can see all the details, and then you make your decision. So I hope that principle is clear. Don't make decisions in the dark. And then bringing that back to being unapologetically sexual. In my current relationship, the thing that works the best for me and Amelia is this. We communicate everything. There are things that I know are going to be uncomfortable for her to hear. There are things that I want to ask her that I know will be uncomfortable for me. And we bring it into the light. We're unapologetic about it. Here are my thoughts, feelings, desires, fantasies, etc. I'm going to speak them, and I'm going to put them out there in the light. And if she's uncomfortable, she's uncomfortable. And if I'm uncomfortable, I'm uncomfortable. And I would much rather be uncomfortable than have anything live in the dark. Because when it's in the dark and you make any decisions on it, destruction. So over the 7 years of our relationship, this has only become better and better. We have only become more and more clear with each other, more and more communicative, more and more in the light, so to speak. And we've addressed some very, very sensational topics, things that are filled with prior jealousies and insecurities. We've talked about all of it, and we've dealt with all of it. And we continue to deal with it because we are unapologetic in how we address these issues. I have my thoughts, desires, and feelings, and she knows all of them. And she doesn't like all of them. She just, there are some things she's just like, I'm uncomfortable with that. And I'm like, I get that. And this is what's so. And me in my speaking it no longer lives in the dark, and it will never be acted upon or chosen or thought of in the dark. And the beautiful thing with this is this, and this is an exercise. Oftentimes you may have, we'll use sexuality as the topic here. You may have a fantasy of something, like some wild, like crazy idea, like, ooh, this would be so amazing. You have thoughts, you're thinking about it, and you're like, the sensation of it in your mind is just wonderful. And you're like, I don't want to tell my partner. They're going to be uncomfortable. They're going to think there's something wrong about me. They'll never go for it, whatever. And so you bring it to the dark. Let's say or out of the dark, you bring it to the light and you say, look, this is a fantasy. And then it's like, okay, let's talk about it. That sounds really like sensational. Like a lot of pleasure may come of that. And then you start to think about it further in the light. Well, what would the consequence of that be? Is that consequence worth pursuing? No, it's not actually something I actually want to do. It's just something I wanted to talk about. It's something I wanted to get out. It's something I wanted to say. And then we have the conversation about it. And we're like, okay, if your partner is open to entertaining your unapologetic sexuality, then you have an opportunity to really put it in the light. And then the choice comes to, do you want to pursue this at the cost of whatever impact that may have had or may have? And oftentimes those fantasies become, you're like, once I say it out loud, I'm like, I don't really actually want that. And maybe this is similar to like, you want to buy something. Oh, I really want this car, this very specific car. And if you hold on to it and you keep it in and you play with it, it grows in the dark. But then as you bring it to the light and you really look at it and you talk with your partner and you're like, look, this is the car that I want and it's beautiful. And here's all the emotional reasons why I think that would be amazing. All the sensational components, all the desires. Okay, cool. Let's talk about it. Let's just let it be open. And then you start to look at it in the light and you're like, well, here's the practical aspect of the financial components of that. Well, here's the practical aspects of driving it in, certain settings. And here's the practical aspects of maintaining it and on and on and on. And you're like, you know what? After I looked at all of those details, I don't want to pursue this. And I appreciate you respecting that my desire was there and we entertained it. We looked at it. I'm unapologetically desirous of this car and I'm not going to buy it. And it's free. And I don't mean, what I mean is you're free. You're free in that expression. You're free in the opportunity to look at it, to be unapologetically desirous of something and then not pursue it. And then your partner has the opportunity to really get you. And then maybe you're looking at this car and then your partner's like, you know what? I really wanted one of those too. I'm glad you brought that up. Let's really dive into the discussion of this. And then you look at it and you're like, you know what? This makes sense financially. This makes sense practically. Let's do this. And then together you go and you enjoy the thing that you chose together. And of course you can apply that to any sexual fantasy or whatever you want to. But do you see where if you don't bring it to the light, there's no opportunity for it to be? So again, I declare myself to be unapologetically sexual. Why? Because it's something that gives me life, that gives me connection to my partner, that gives me thrill, that gives me experience. And my purpose is to elevate the experience of being human. And I will follow the principle of not making decisions in the dark. And that is one of my life's principles. So at the end of this, I want to challenge you to look at your own situation. Are you living unapologetically? Are you bringing all aspects of your being to your partner, to your life out there in the open, to the light? Are you free? Or are you caught in a drift, hiding from, embarrassed by? Look at it. You have the opportunity to become unapologetic, unapologetically sexual, unapologetically political, unapologetically excellent in your pursuits. When you don't hide things, you don't put them in the dark. It's in the light. All right, thank you. This has been Unapologetically Sexual, Escape the Drift podcast. I'm Dr. Jacob Egbert.